This is Brave New History. We're here with Maverick Christian. Oops, my thumb got in the way there. Maybe I'll edit that out. But so yeah, this is Brave New History, and we're here with Maverick Christian. Let's see, he has a blog by the same name and a YouTube channel. So go subscribe. And today we're talking about the moral argument, which probably it's done a lot in debate, but here we'll have a breakdown and see why Maverick Christian is going to make the point of why it might be underrated. So yeah, thanks for coming.
Hey, you're welcome.
Oh, and then here I should add that Maverick Christian and I go way back at community college.
Yeah, it's been almost 20 years now, hasn't it? Like,
isn't that
about
crazy?
20 years.
Think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so after I went to community college, I went to University of Minnesota to get a computer science degree. I minored in mathematics. Later on, I went to get a bachelor's in philosophy, and now I'm a philosophy grad student.
Yeah. And now, I'd seen that. I've been thinking about going to divinity school. I'm gonna have to do that, but yeah, how is that? And you're doing an online course, right?
Yeah. So I work full time as a software developer, then I'm a part-time grad student.
Yeah, good deal. Yeah, it's is it unusual being a Christian philosophy student? It probably skews like 99-100, no?
I don't know what the statistics are. That's kind of a good question. I know that theists are in the relative minority among philosophers at large. Though there are some significant Christian philosophers throughout time, like even in contemporary times, like Alexander Proust, of course. And slightly older, you have Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, you have Richard Swinburne. So there are a lot of notable ones out there, but I think like they're kind of in the minority, even if they're like a notable minority.
Yeah. Which, I guess there are people that would count William Lane Craig as a philosopher.
Oh, yeah, as a PhD in philosophy. And and he's probably like one of the single most responsible people responsible for reviving the Kalam cosmological argument, which is very widely discussed in philosophy.
Yeah, which he brings up, that it's normally brought up that the Kalam cosmological argument is anything that exists has a cause, right?
Well, that's one version of it. I mean, there are multiple versions of it, but I think a lot of people who know about it online are like, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. At least that's part of the Kalam cosmological argument. You get into like semantics, like, okay, is the conceptual analysis part of the Kalam cosmological argument? And yeah,
absolutely. So, do you want to get right into it? The moral argument?
Yeah, sure. I'll just share my screen here. And
all right. And for everybody watching, feel free to put your questions in the chat. Maybe we can just, or comments.
All right. Do you see my screen?
Yep. You can also upload. Oh, there you go.
All right. So here we go. Why the moral argument is underrated, even if it's unsound. So here's William Lane Craig's version. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Now, my version is a little bit simpler. I just say if God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. Some things are morally wrong, like torturing infants just for fun. Therefore, God exists. I just think it's simpler that way. Now, the general structure is this. If A, then C. C is false. Therefore, A is true. So this argument is logically valid. And logically valid just means it's logically impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion. So for it to be unsound, it'll need a false premise. Where a sound argument is one that's logically valid and has all true premises.
So here, if we can go back, it's not immediately clear to me that it's valid can we maybe go back to it? The premise 1 and 2?
Okay. God does not exist and nothing is morally wrong. Some things are morally wrong, therefore God exists.
Okay, so
it might be easier if you see the structure. So this is the structure. If A, then C. C is false, therefore A is true. So this uses a logical rule of logic known as modus tollens.
Yeah.
If A, then C. Not C, that is C is false, therefore A is true.
Yeah. Did you say, just going back to community college, did you take logic there?
Yeah, I took logic. That was one of the courses I took. I took logic in later on also when I went to get my philosophy degree, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is basic stuff. You learned this. I don't remember his name.
Yeah. Was he like, he had a ponytail? He looked like an old school professor?
Maybe this was like 20 years ago. So.
Oh yeah, so you probably don't remember. Yeah.
It rings a bell, though.
What's that?
It rings a bell. Donahue does ring a bell.
Yeah. Let's see. No, it wasn't Donahoe. It was the other guy. No, he was only like, I only went to his class a few times. Anyway, it doesn't drive the moral argument, but can we go back to the previous slide?
Yeah, so A is if God does not exist. C is nothing is morally wrong. 2 is C is false. And
so if God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong.
That's the first premise, yeah.
Okay, so I would say I disagree with that, and some things are morally wrong. So I would agree with that. So then, okay, so if God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. How about why the double negative there? Like, so how about if God exists, then some things are morally wrong?
So the reason why I think the God does not exist and nothing is morally wrong, I think the reason why I and Craig use that is because the first premise is more intuitive. It's kind of easier to argue for. I'll go into that later. I haven't even really gotten to any of the supposed justifications for the premises yet.
Got it. Okay. Okay, yeah, so we'll continue. So I agree with premise 2, but I don't necessarily see why premise 1 should be.
Okay. So I'll kind of give what's interesting about this argument is that there are loads of atheists who agree, are like you, that agree with the second but deny the first. There are also loads of atheists who deny the second and either believe or are rationally committed to believing the first premise. So I'm going to describe to you later in this why some atheists are rationally committed to the first premise, either believe it's true or are rationally committed to do it.
Well, you could hold that also under theism, yeah? Or under anything, right?
Well, I guess a little bit complicated. We can go into it a little bit later, though. So I'll just continue describing the moral argument here. So one thing that's very important is moral semantics, which is about how we define moral terminology. Because the one thing I've noticed is that sometimes theists and atheists use different definitions of morality, and they kind of end up talking past each other. So even if this seems kind of redundant, it's kind of important also. So moral obligations have an ought component for them. So for example, an action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not to do it. But what type of ought are we using here? So we actually use ought, words like ought and should, in a couple of different ways in ordinary discourse. So one type of ought is what we could call a descriptive ought. This is a type of ought that's reducible to something purely descriptive. So example would be when if you want to do well in school, you ought to study just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. So in this example, this ought is what philosophers call a hypothetical ought or conditional ought. And it has a purely descriptive meaning. It refers to a possible action that is practically necessary to achieve some goal. So observant folks might notice that you do this all the time in ordinary discourse. Then there's that other type of ought, which you could call a Humean ought, named after Scottish philosopher David Hume, who put forth his famous is-ought distinction. Hume specifically had the moral ought in mind. So this type of ought is not a descriptive ought. It prescribes in a way that's not truly descriptive. So someone saying you should not torture infants just for fun might have this type of ought in mind. It's the type of ought that we use in morality, at least when ordinary people talk about what you morally should and shouldn't do. This is the type of ought they typically have in mind.
Well, here, go ahead.
So again, the moral ought is the human ought. It is false that the moral ought has only descriptive qualities. For example, when you say an action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not to do it. Now, as a warning, some non-theists have moral semantics where moral oughts are entirely descriptive, and this is why I talked about moral semantics. So what are you going to say?
Let's see. Have moral semantics where moral oughts are purely descriptive. Yeah, I would think that perhaps all oughts are really descriptive oughts. That a Humean ought just has unstated descriptors.
Now, there are some people who say that there are only hypothetical oughts, those type of oughts that have an only descriptive meaning. But when most people talk about morality, they don't have in mind that type of ought. That's why Hume had his famous is ought problem, because if the moral ought had an entirely descriptive meaning, that is ought problem would exist in the first place. In ordinary discourse, the type of ought that we use is prescribed in a way that isn't purely descriptive. And yeah. So you could.
So I mean, would you think that maybe you said you were calling it prescriptive oughts or descriptive?
Oh, I call this a human ought, named after Scottish philosopher David Hume, who put forth this famous is ought distinction.
Okay, so there's
the moral on mind.
So there's certain prescriptions, or did you say descriptions, or what is it?
So what I call the descriptive ought is the type of ought that is reducible to the purely descriptive. So the type of example that we have in ordinary discourse is what philosophers call the hypothetical ought or the conditional ought.
Got it. Okay, so would you think that the descriptive ought, we just have conditions that are unstated? So it's like, well, under duty ethics, right? If a duty exists, then you ought not to do this. And if survival is our goal, you ought not do this. Or if we're going to, have, utilitarian view, you ought not to do this, right? Or if pleasure is our goal, right, we ought not do that, or we ought to do it. Do you think that maybe it's just nebulous on what the conditions are, rather than it's kind of like because ought only really makes sense if you say ought if, right?
Well, you could. Some philosophers believe that only the hypothetical or conditional ought exists. There are some who believe that, but when most people talk about morality, they typically have in mind that Humean ought. That it would. To kind of think about it again, think back to David Hume and his famous is ought problem. If the ought was, for example, a conditional ought, something that had a purely descriptive meaning, there wouldn't be an is ought problem. The only reason why there's an is ought problem is because that's not the type of ought we'd ordinarily have in mind with respect to morality.
Why wouldn't there be an is ought problem?
Well, because if an ought had a purely descriptive meaning, then you could deduce an ought from an is, right? Like if you want to do well in school, you ought to study just means something like as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study, do well in school. Well, then you could deduce an ought from an is because they're synonymous.
Is it? So if you want to do well in school, you ought to study. That makes sense to me, right?
Yeah. Now, if that just means as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school, then you could deduce one from the other. You could deduce as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study, do well in school. Deduce from that, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study. You could deduce an ought from an is. But the type of ought that Hume had in mind was the moral ought. And that type of ought, at least in ordinary discourse, is not that type of ought. It's that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. That's why a lot of philosophers look at it and say, yeah, how do you deduce an ought from an is?
So is it like, if you want to be moral, you ought to do this?
That's true, but that's not what a moral ought is. It's a type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. You could say the moral ought has some descriptive qualities, but it does not have only descriptive qualities. If, for example, you imbue it with an entirely descriptive meaning, there wouldn't be that is ought problem. So that moral ought is like a fundamentally different category from the hypothetical ought.
Okay, so let's say, I mean, so the example here, you should not torture infants just for fun. It's kind of like it's smuggling in the context, right? With just for fun, right? So it's kind of like we're heading off the whole thing like for morally justifiable reasons, right? For like it saves a greater number of people, or it avoids people getting run over by a train or something like that, right?
Yeah, this is
That
kind of a very popular example of something that's morally wrong, just because it's largely uncontroversial. Like
yeah,
most
well,
people
I
aren't going to
mean,
contest that it's wrong to torture infants just for fun.
yeah, because it's just the fun for no real reason, right? So it's kind of divorcing context from it.
Yeah,
That
kind of.
so it's kind of like, is it kind of like giving the game away that there's always context to it, right? Like there's no like you can't appeal to deontology or utilitarianism or hedonism, right? There's no real way to appeal. There's no well way to like nebulously appeal to a descriptive odd. So we would just say, well, yeah, that's wrong, but we're kind of intuitively thinking, well, this is like this holds true no matter what, right? Like it's just true by itself regardless of context. You kind of see what I mean?
Kind of. Anyway, that's just an example. Somebody
Sure.
who utters that statement might have that type of ought in mind, the human ought. So it's just an example of what someone might mean by that. I haven't even gotten to whether that statement is true. I'm just saying this is an
Sure.
example of that type of ought, that type of should. Anyway, but yeah, like I said, some non-theists have moral semantics where moral oughts are entirely descriptive. But when theists like William Lane Craig and basically just anybody else talk about morality or in the moral argument, this is the type of moral semantics they're typically dealing with. But I think a lot of non-theists don't realize that. And so we can end up talking past each other. All right. So a kind of consequence of this type of moral semantics is moral properties are empirically detectable. I can illustrate what I mean by that like as follows. So imagine a moral nihilist who does not believe in moral wrongness and a moral realist who does believe in moral wrongness. Observe some jerk kicking a dog just for fun. Now the dog whimpers in pain and runs away. Now both agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts involved. So for example, the dog felt pain and suffered minor injury. Moral nihilist says, I don't think moral oughtness, like moral wrongness, is attached to that action. The moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is attached to that action. But there's no empirical way to determine who is right. Both views, moral nihilism and moral realism, are empirically identical. They agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts involved. And the reason why this kind of helps illustrate that morality, again, on the moral semantics I'm using, is non-natural. So natural facts, facts of chemistry, physics, and so forth, are purely descriptive. Whereas deontic moral facts, facts of what we morally should and shouldn't do, are not purely descriptive on the human, not moral semantics. So deontic moral facts are non-natural. And this kind of gets into why some atheists accept the first premise or are actually committed to it. Now, it's a theorem that given A, probably C entails probably if A, then C. So here it is for math and logic nerds. So given God's non-existence, it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists. Entails that premise one is at least probably true. And if you want to know more about it, I have a blog post on it. It's if you have high school mathematics, you can follow along. I only minored in mathematics, so my abilities to prove things are limited. But even if you have proving it would be tricky. Following along is not that hard at all, as long as you graduate high school and have a decent understanding of math from there. So why might an atheist accept premise one? Well, an atheist might reason like this. Moral wrongness is very strange. It's invisible, non-physical, and empirically undetectable. Very strange property when you think about it. So why shouldn't the consistent atheists reject the existence of this invisible, non-physical thing that cannot be empirically detected if they're to reject the existence of invisible, non-physical deities that have allegedly not been empirically detected? So given atheism, it's more likely people's belief in moral wrongness is a delusion brought about by evolution to get us to behave in certain ways and help our species survive. So given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist. That's what an atheist might think. And so an atheist who believes that given God's non-existence, it is likely that moral wrongness exists is rationally committed to believing that premise one is at least probably true. Now, what's more, anyone who believes that God does not exist and moral wrongness does not exist is rationally committed to believing, given God's non-existence, it is likely that moral wrongness does. Well, it is likely that moral wrongness doesn't exist. I kind of realized I worded that incorrectly, but that would also be rationally committed to accepting premise one. So I have that also proved theorem on my blog. This math proof is a lot easier to go through than the other one. So some atheists believe that this type of moral argument is terrible. But for it to be unsound, they'll need a false premise. But if the argument is so terrible, which one is obviously false? Now, a lot of atheists, like you, perhaps, agree with premise two. For many atheists, it's not reasonable to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing if it's just for fun in the ordinary sense of moral wrongness, which uses the human yacht. However, there are also a lot of atheists who agree that moral wrongness is unlikely given God's non-existence. And anyone who believes that God does not exist and moral wrongness does not exist is rationally committed to believing premise one. So some atheists will say, well, I disagree with both premises. Well, that's not really an option. If you believe that God does not exist and moral wrongness does not exist, you're rationally committed to accepting that first premise.
Well, yeah, I mean, under Craig's version, I would disagree with both because he's trying to kind of change the subjective objective thing. But this is a little bit more simple.
Yeah, because I realize that some people have get into semantics of what it means for morality to be objective or not. And it's like, I mean, I think Craig arguments works, but I think the idea of introducing the term objective, I think confuses some people. So I just get rid of it.
Yeah, I view it as it's intended to obfuscate, where he defines objective as independent of human minds and leans heavily on human, and God's not human. So then it can hold true in God's mind, and then that makes it objective, which it's still a mind, and it should be regardless of minds. And so I kind of think that that's I think that's kind of why he worded it like that.
Well, the thing about philosophy is that the same term can mean different things in different contexts. So I mean, it could look up the term moral objectivism right now, and it would show up things that are morally wrong independently of human opinion. All right, so that use does exist within philosophy. How to define objective actually gets really tricky when you define it in analytical detail, but it's a complication that we don't need to consider here.
Yeah.
But at any rate, anyone believing that God does not exist and moral wrongness does not exist is rationally committed to believing that given God's non-existence, it is likely that moral wrongness does not exist, which in turn would imply that premise one is true. So my thoughts, even if this argument is unsound, this sort of moral argument is underrated. It's not terrible, since each premise enjoys substantial plausibility independently of its conclusion. Each premise has a backing of a substantial number of atheists. And yeah, that's the end of the presentation. To recap, an atheist believing that both premises are false is not really an option. If you're an atheist who believes that God does not exist and moral wrongness does not exist, irrationally committed to accepting the first premise is probably true. And there are loads of atheists who accept the second premise, but there are also loads of atheists who either believe or are rationally committed to believing the first premise. And I think the argument was quote unquote terrible. It should be more obvious which premise is false. And that is why, in a nutshell, I believe this argument is kind of underrated, even if it's unsound.
Yeah. So, how is God and morality? What do they have to do with each other? It's not immediately clear to me.
Well, the way that I offered in it, the first premise, is that what you do, what I do is I put on my atheist hat here and say, okay, if I were an atheist, what I believe. So let's suppose, for sake of argument, that atheism is true. Now, for some atheists, it will be rather easy. And then you say, okay, I'll evaluate. How likely is it that there is such a thing as moral wrongness? And as I think about it, it's yeah, it seems kind of unlikely that moral wrongness exists, given God's non-existence. And then that leaves, and now if that's true, then the first premise is true. And that's really all you need. I know that some people go on to say it's well, God grounds morality. So
yeah, how though? What's the relationship between morality and God?
Well, all you need for this first premise to be probably true is that given God's non-existence, it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists. And that's all you need. Now you could say, okay, is there any further connection to that? Well, there is a little bit. So we have to remember that some conceptions of theism entail moral objectivism. They entail that there is such a thing as right and wrong. You might say, it's like, well, that's not enough. Well, as long as that's true, and it is true that given God's non-existence, it is likely that moral wrongness does not exist. That's really all you need for the first premise to be true. So even though it might sound like a weak connection at first, mathematically, logically, that's really all you need.
So, I mean, but why would somebody think that? Why would somebody think that, like, there's any relation between God and morality?
Well, for what I just said before, there are certain conceptions of God that entail that there is such a thing as moral right and wrong. Whereas given God's non-existence, it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists.
Aren't there conceptions of atheism that hold to right and wrong?
You could come up with an idea that atheism is true and there is such a thing as a moral right and wrong. The problem is that given God's non-existence, it is, or at least so many atheists believe, given God's non-existence, it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists. It's more likely.
Why would it be unlikely? Why would it be unlikely?
So, put on my atheist hat again. So remember what I said before, that moral wrongness, when you think about it, is a very strange property. It's invisible, non-physical, and empirically undetectable. So why shouldn't the consistent atheist reject the existence of this invisible, non-physical thing that cannot be empirically detected if the consistent atheist reject the existence of invisible, non-physical deities that have not been empirically detected? So given atheism, it seems more likely that people's belief in moral wrongness is a delusion brought about by evolution to get us to behave in certain ways and help our species survive. So just like, an atheist might say that humans, we evolved belief in gods, for example. Maybe that an atheist might believe that, they believe that gods punish bad people in the afterlife, and that's how people get along, is because of that false belief. But we know that these non-natural entities that we call gods don't exist. They're invisible, non-physical. They seem a bit weird. And so it seems unlikely they exist. Well, it seems to me that same type of reasoning also applies to moral wrongness. People believe in moral wrongness because, it helps them to get in behaviors like, I want to be a good person. There are things that I should do. But moral wrongness, very much like the existence of God from an atheist perspective, it's this invisible, non-physical thing that we can't be empirically detected. So it does seem unlikely, at least that's what I would believe if I were an atheist, that this strange, non-physical thing exists. It's
a bit of, it's hard to describe, right? I guess is the gist of it. So morality is not easily describable. And then go ahead.
Well, it's not that. It's like, let's consider this claim. Suppose you meet somebody who says, there's an invisible unicorn floating above my head right now. You probably would believe that claim is probably false. Why would you believe that's probably false? Well, it has a certain deviation from the types of things that we know exists. Mm-hmm. And that makes it unlikely. That's why we like basically any fantastical claim, like there's an invisible dragon in my garage. Any claim that has postulates something that wildly diverges from the types of things that we know exist, we tend to think of it as unlikely. And it seems to me that same principle holds true for something like moral wrongness. Here's another way to think about it. If moral wrong exists, how do we know about it? We can't see it. We can't empirically detect it in any way. It almost seems like we need something like supernatural clairvoyance to know that this non-natural, invisible, empirically undetectable thing exists. So what other thing do we know that's like that? That, okay, there's this thing exists. The only way we can determine it is through supernatural powers of clairvoyance. There's nothing like that at all that we know that exists. Now, if you're a theist, the problem is actually pretty easy to solve. You could appeal like God designed our cognitive faculties in such a way that when they're functioning properly, we intuitively apprehend these moral truths. God is supernatural; He knows all moral truths, and so for theism, this is actually pretty easy to solve from an atheist standpoint. Especially if you're a naturalist and you don't believe in supernatural. This seems like pretty far-fetched stuff. This moral wrongness, non-natural moral wrongness stuff. So I'm very sympathetic to atheists who think that it seems very unlikely that this non-natural stuff exists. It seems that it probably doesn't exist. And I think that's why a lot of atheists reject the second premise and are either believe or are rationally committed to accepting that first premise.
Gotcha. So, yeah, there's Aren't there a few things that are just not really easily explained or not simply explained? Like, it reminds me, Frank Turek, right? Thoughts are, who I'm talking about, Frank Turek.
I've seen some of his videos. Yeah, I don't pay that much attention to him. I tend to. I mean, no, I don't want to like insult anybody, but Frank Turek is a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, simplistic. He doesn't have that level of philosophical sophistication, at least in his popular talks that I've seen from other people.
Yeah, yeah. So he'll do this thing where thoughts and the mind are supernatural, and so you'll say no, thoughts are physical, like they're a process of the mind, right? Like, and then he would say, like, where's the physical representation of that thought? I was like, I gotcha. Like, thoughts exist in the mind, right? Which is a process of the brain, right? But I like almost like feigns not to get it, right? Like, I think maybe that's a little bit of what we have going on, that there is a physical process going on, right? Where we can see, yeah, that action doesn't lead to survival. It's like it crosses, deontological lines where it's like we can see that that's what's going on, right? And then like people disagree on morality, right? So some people say, well, we should really focus on hedonism, and we should really or duties or utilitarianism or whatever, right? And then even if you have like a certain certain, let's say we'll use different descriptors, right? To have the descriptive art, that we might disagree of what description we're going to use, right? For the art, for the morality, right? And then even if you're using that, you can disagree on the specifics of it, right? So like the pro-life, pro-choice debate, I think maybe that's on duty, right? Do you have a duty to self, the individual rights, or duty to the baby, right? And you can disagree on that, but we're all disagreeing about morality. What's the moral thing to do? So it seems unlikely that we're guided by like an object, like you could say that like this is moral under these guidelines, right? But it doesn't seem like there's a supernatural process going on. But let's say there is a supernatural process, right? Let's say that morality is supernatural. A lot of people, don't believe in God, but they believe in the supernatural, right? So I don't know if it necessarily follows that it would be like a deity causing morality.
Well, the first premise, there's no part of the argument that says a deity causes morality. That's nowhere part of the morality of the argument. It's a little bit simpler than that. It just argues that, at least the way I argue it, is okay. Suppose we assume, for sake of argument, that God does not exist. Just suppose it is true that God does not exist. Is it likely that moral wrongness does not exist? I think it does. Now, again, that type of reasoning isn't going to convince everybody. Some atheists are convinced by it, and some atheists are not convinced by it. And yet, is it possible to believe in the supernatural without believing in God? I mean, yes, but I mean, do we have any? I mean, suppose God does not exist. Do we have any really good reason to believe that we humans have supernatural powers of clairvoyance? I mean, I'm pretty skeptical that we do have good reason to believe in that. Yeah.
So, like, I mean, I'm only hearing like assertions that there's a relationship between God and morality.
Well, I gave an argument for it, right? So I use what is in philosophy is called an argument from queerness. So think of the invisible unicorn illustration. It's a type of thing that is wildly different from the type invisible unicorn is wildly different from the types of things we know exists. And if that is true, we award it with a low prima facie probability. Now, if morality fits that category, as I believe it does under atheism, it would follow that we should award it with a low prima facie probability. That's the reasoning behind it. I think
Why
that's why a
should
lot of,
we?
huh?
Like, why should we? I mean, so let's say we're dealing with abstract things that, like abstract things that are grounded in the physical, right? So let's say math or language, right? Are we saying that maybe those have supernatural properties to them?
No, I don't think it would follow at all. So that would fall under the category of what Hume called relations of ideas. So we can look at what words mean and the kind of the relations to each other to find out what they mean. So here's another way to look at it. Suppose that there are these relations of ideas, mathematics. Does that prevent an invisible unicorn from being queer? No, it doesn't. The mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4, have to do with relations of ideas, whereas invisible unicorns, they're an entirely separate thing. They're what Hume would call matters of fact, rather than relations of ideas. So whether these non-natural properties exist, like moral wrongness, whether deities exist, whether there's an invisible dragon in my garage, those are matters of fact. They're not relations of ideas.
So, okay, so it's unusual, right? So it's queer. So then it's supernatural, or there. I mean, there has to be more to it, right?
So just think of how we ordinarily evaluate fantastical claims, like an invisible unicorn I'm floating top my head, or just like a flying saucer landed in my backyard. If it's a type of thing, if it's wildly different from the types of things we know exist, we usually award it with a low prima facie probability. That's just, we do this all the time, and it would seem arbitrary to not have moral wrongness as part of it if we judge it to be so queer in that way. It'd be special pleading.
Okay, so it's unusual. I mean, so how do we?
More precisely, it's wildly different from the types of things we know exists. The kind of philosophical word that's used for it is queer. Comes from J.L. Mackie in the 20th century, famous atheist.
Okay, so it's different from things we know exist. Yeah, so it's different from things that we know exist.
Yeah, wildly different from the types of things we know exist. Again, think of an invisible dragon in my garage. Think about flying saucer landing in my backyard. Think of me claiming that I have supernatural powers of clairvoyance. You would all award those with a low prior probability. Why? Well, it's precisely because it's queer in that way. Whereas if I say, I had coffee this morning, you're not going to automatically disbelieve me because that's mundane. That sort of thing happens all the time. Whereas like saucer lands in my backyard, there's a visible dragon in my garage, you're not going to believe me even if I say those words because, again, queerness.
So it's unusual. It's different from things that we know exist. Maybe I'm wording it differently than you would. So how do you get from that to supernatural?
Well, I don't. That's not the argument for it being supernatural.
Okay.
The argument for it being non-natural is an entirely different argument. And that has to do with the moral semantics. So remember how I described the human ought is that type of ought that is not descriptive. It's not purely descriptive anyway. It doesn't have only descriptive qualities. Now think of what natural facts are: facts of physics, facts of chemistry. All those are descriptive facts. But the moral ought, that human ought, is not reducible to purely descriptive. It fits in an entirely different category. So deontic moral facts, that is, facts of what we morally should and shouldn't do, are not natural facts. So they're going to be non-natural. Even if we don't call it supernatural, they're at least non-natural. They're not part of the natural physical world. And to illustrate that, that's why I use that example of moral wrongness being empirically detectable. Imagine a moral nihilist who does not believe in moral wrongness and a moral realist who does believe in moral wrongness. They both observe some jerk kicking a dog just for fun. Moral nihilist says, I don't think moral wrongness is associated with action. Moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is associated with action. Both sides agree on all the same physical facts. They agree on all the same scientific, observable, natural facts, but they disagree whether moral wrongness is associated with that action. That's precisely because moral wrongness is non-natural, at least under more ordinary moral semantics, because the moral ought is not reducible to entirely descriptive. It's a different category of thing.
Okay, so
the non-naturalness of morality is part of the reason why it's queer, why it's different from the types of things we know exist.
So does that seem like a little bit circular? It's non-natural because
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
It's the semantics. It's how we define morality that leads it to be non-natural. If we use that Humean moral semantics, if we use the ordinary moral semantics, what the person on the street means when they say something is morally wrong, they're using that type of thought that isn't purely descriptive. Now, if that's the semantics we're working with, then it leads to moral wrongness being non-natural. If it exists at all, anyway. An atheist could still say, this moral wrongness thing you're talking about, that seems a bit queer to me. I don't think it exists. An atheist could take that stance. But if moral wrongness exists, again, in the sense that I described it, then it's going to be non-natural.
Okay, so in the same way that morality is a little bit strange, and God is a little bit strange, we're kind of in the strangeness they're related.
Well, the relation, as far as how I justified the first premise, all it is that given God's non-existence, it is unlikely that moral wrongness does not exist. And the reason why an atheist might think that is precisely because of that argument from queerness. Now, if you're a theist, moral wrongness isn't that queer. You already have the supernatural. But for atheists, if atheism is true, it does seem that moral wrongness would be queer in a way to make it unlikely to exist, at least prima facie. Prima facie unlikely.
Okay. So, in terms of so we're equating morality with other subjective things like beauty, right? Which aren't necessarily that quantitative or don't seem to be quantitative.
This is something entirely different from that. It says that moral wrongness, if it exists, is non-natural, and you can't empirically detect it, at least barring the supernatural. And because of that, because of the way what moral wrongness would be if it existed, it's queer in a way to make it prima facie unlikely, given atheism. And really, that's all the relation you need between God's existence and moral wrongness, is that given God's non-existence, it's unlikely that moral wrongness does not exist. It's unlikely that moral wrongness exists.
And that's because morality is unusual.
More precisely, given atheism, it's queer in a way to make it prima facie unlikely. It's wildly different from the types of things that we know exists. Again, think an invisible dragon in my garage. Think of a ghost floating around in this room. Think of it like a flying saucer landing outside my house. That sort of thing.
So, so we would class like a flying saucer as supernatural?
No, I said queer, not supernatural. Queer as wildly different from the types of things that we know exists. And so that would, for naturalists, that would probably encompass the supernatural. It wouldn't necessarily be limited to that.
Okay, so flying saucer is queer, but it's not supernatural.
Or at least it needn't be. I suppose it depends what literature you read. Science fiction, fantasy literature you're reading anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would imagine that
some of them blow the lines, yeah.
But I imagine for a lot of atheists, supernatural stuff would probably be queer to them.
Yeah. But as flying saucer from Caladan would be not supernatural, but it would be unusual, right?
It would definitely be unusual. I haven't seen too many of those.
Yeah. So, but for our purposes, we're not counting that as supernatural.
Yeah, this is just an illustration of the idea that if something is wildly different from the types of things we know exist, we award it with a low prima facie probability, just as a matter of a general principle. And for the atheist, supernatural would be one example. It wouldn't be the only example.
Okay, what's yeah, maybe I'm just not getting the connection between why morality would be supernatural.
Okay, well, think about this. Okay, all natural facts of physics, chemistry, and so forth are purely descriptive, right? They describe facts. Okay. Now, deontic world facts, facts of moral rightness and wrongness, are not purely descriptive, at least under Humean moral ought semantics. Are you with me so far?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, yeah, I think Hume is wrong there.
Hume didn't know what his own words meant?
I guess you could say that. Like all morality exists within a certain context, right?
I mean, you could come up with a system of like a set of hypothetical oughts and call it morality. Where all moral oughts actually have an entirely descriptive meaning. It's just that that's not the moral semantics the person on the street uses. You'd be basically, if you redefine terms like that, you're basically just changing the subject.
Well, I mean, at that point, I mean, then we're not describing it accurately, right?
Describing what accurately?
Morality.
No, I mean that's what people mean when they use terms like morally wrong, is that they're using the type of ought that is not really descriptive. That's what they mean by the term. I mean, there's no God of the English language saying this is what the word means and this is what that word means. It's just something that it's decided by a linguistic community that this is what the word means. And in ordinary discourse, this is kind of what we implicitly decided what morality means. That the moral ought is not a hypothetical ought. It doesn't have an entirely descriptive meaning. We mean something else by it.
See, I'm not sure that's the case.
I mean, this is how I have always understood morality ever since I was a kid. I mean, we observe that, hypothetical oughts are used in ordinary discourse, but when we refer to morality, how I learned as a native speaker of English that, okay, it's that other type of ought. And I think most people use that way. Now I noticed that some non-theists, without being aware of it, apparently, have redefined morality. So it might, for example, has an entirely descriptive meaning, like a hypothetical ought. But it's just not what most people mean when they talk about morality.
So, when we talk about why ought we tell the truth, right? We're told, well, because of the boy who cried wolf, right? And why should I not punch someone? Well, would you want to be punched? Right? Or why should I not steal? Right? Well, what would happen if everybody stole? Right? But Jimmy down the block steals. Well, if Jimmy down the block jumped off a bridge, would you do it? Right? That it's kind of always like descriptive, right? That there's a reason why we ought or ought not to do it.
Well, just because there are practical reasons to be moral does not mean that the moral ought itself has an entirely descriptive meaning. So you could say, remember how I defined that human ought is that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. Now it might have some descriptive qualities. Like you could say, like, well, there are practical reasons to be moral. Yes, but in addition to that, the moral ought of ordinary discourse is that type of ought that is not really descriptive. It doesn't have an entirely descriptive meaning. Now, again, you just kind of ask yourself, why was there a Hume's is ought problem? Why was that a problem in the first place, specifically when Hume had the moral ought in mind? Well, if he was using the hypothetical ought, this would not be a problem in the first place. So I think that should be like your first clue that ordinarily this is the type of ought people have in mind. They don't have the type of ought that is the hypothetical ought.
So, yeah, I'm not sure I follow. So, is there a Humean ought that does not have descriptive qualities to it?
As I said, it's pretty clear. And so what I called it the Humean ought after Scottish philosopher David Hume, who had his famous is ought distinction. Now, if Hume did have the type of ought that had a purely descriptive meaning, there wouldn't have been that problem in the first place. Because how do you deduce from one out from this? Well, it's easy. These two terms are synonymous. This term means the exact same thing as that term, and so he can deduce an ought from an is, easy as pie. He didn't, of course, there'll be reason why that's not the case is because that's not the type of ought we was using. We can read it in context. And again, he specifically had the moral ought in mind. Clearly, he was using that type of ought that was not a hypothetical one, that was not a conditional ought. And yeah, that's why
So what's not a conditional ought? If like that is purely a human ought that has that exists absent any context.
I don't know what you mean by absent any context. Are you referring to like not conditioned upon a goal that one wants to achieve?
Yeah.
Okay, so in philosophy, one desired characteristic of morality is categoricity. That means reason given independent of one's goals. So that even if you're assuming that by reason means something that makes it proper or appropriate to do an action. Now, if something had this human ought to it, like we should do this, well, then that makes it proper and appropriate to do that action. And then that would be reason giving independent of our goals were, in which case we would have achieved that categoricity criterion. And so that would be an example of what you're asking for.
So what is a particular, can you give a practical example of something that we would look at and see that it has only human oughts, that it exists absent like any practical reason, that it's
well, I suppose imagine you're like let's say a Papa Doc Duvalier, where you can do morally wrong things and there's no like practical benefit for it. You could just get away with it. Well, that person would still have a human ought for them, presumably, even if it doesn't benefit them practically in any way.
So I mean, like some moral action that it has like the purely supernatural quality to it. It doesn't have any physicality, right? It's not descriptive at all. It's purely human.
What you're saying is a bit confusing because I should point out that when I describe the human ought, I'm not saying it has no descriptive qualities. I just said it doesn't have purely descriptive qualities.
Well, right. Although, is there one that has no descriptive qualities and is purely whatever we would call human?
A human ought that has no descriptive qualities whatsoever. That's what you're asking for?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not really sure.
Can you like think of one off the top of your head?
No, not at the top of my head. That's why I said I'm not sure.
Okay. Doesn't that kind of like blow the argument away?
No, it doesn't even remotely follow that just because there is an ought that has some descriptive qualities, that therefore there is no human ought whatsoever.
So it's like saying, okay, so I have coffee here, right? There we go. We'll go like this. So it's not invisible. Like it's actually a supernatural mug. That's why it kind of has this strange quality to it, right? Where you can kind of
I am skeptical because that would be queer.
Yeah, but and so actually this mug actually does ground morality to a small extent, at least locally, at least nearby me, it does ground morality. But okay, so what holds the coffee in here, right? The mug, right? But then we're going to say, yeah, but then there's another thing that holds the coffee in here. What is it? What holds the coffee in here but the mug? Well, something human holds the coffee. No, like I can only think of things that hold the coffee in. That's only the mug, right? You know what I'm saying? So, well, there's something additional that holds the coffee in. Like what else? What is it? Well, everything that's not the mug. Well, it's the mug that holds the coffee in. You kind of get what I'm saying?
No, it's extremely confusing.
So we're saying what grounds morality? Well, the context of what's happening grounds it. Okay, but then there's something else beyond that, the human thing, right? The supernatural thing grounds it as well.
No,
we already have a reason for morality. We don't need.
No, this isn't grounding morality. This is about what we mean by morality. Is it that type of ought that does not have only descriptive characteristics? What do we mean by morality? Now, if what we mean by morality had a purely descriptive meaning, like a hypothetical ought, we wouldn't have this is-ought problem. So it's part of it, the argument for morality being non-natural depends on what do we mean by moral wrongness? What do we mean by the term? If our semantics is the Humean one, then it will be non-natural. Now, if we mean something else by the term, if we redefine morality in terms of only hypothetical oughts, well, then it needn't be non-natural. So it's like, I mean, I could prove this like using fairly rigorously using mathematics and logic, but ultimately it kind of comes down to what do we mean by moral wrongness. If what we mean by morality is that Humean ought moral semantics, then that type of moral wrongness will be non-natural if it exists at all. So kind of ask yourself, do you believe in moral wrongness in that moral semantics I described? If not, then really you should be rejecting the second premise, because that's what I mean by moral wrongness.
So, I mean, if not the hypothetical, right? Like if you want to get good grades, you have to study. If you want to live a healthy life, you ought to take vitamins, right? What would be like, what would be the explanation for the Humean ought?
So that depends on who you ask. So, you know, atheists, theists, they have their own different ontological. Are you asking for like an ontological explanation of like how this moral wrongness thing exists?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand. Like, I get the hypothetical ought with that has description and context, but this other Humean ought, it seems like when it's pressed, it just goes right back to hypothetical oughts. That there's no real. They seem to be the same thing, kind of, right? Where they say, well, okay, there's the physical and there's the context and the descriptors to it. But then there's something else, you know, and that makes it supernatural. And then I'm thinking, well, what's the something else? Right? Like what is this other kind of like supernatural morality? Like
Well,
what makes it supernatural, or what makes it like, I guess we could say like, well, it's queer, all right, but like a lot of things are like the moral argument. So I mean the moral argument isn't supernatural, but
what makes it non-natural is the fact that all natural facts are descriptive. They're purely descriptive. And deontic moral facts are not purely descriptive facts. They're not reducible to purely descriptive, from which it follows logically and inescapably that deontic
it sounds like you're just like reasserting the premise rather than like defending the premise.
Well, which premise am I?
So like
premise they're talking about. There are two premises.
So so I'm just trying to understand, like, the deontics, right, are not descriptive.
On Humean moral ought semantics, yes.
How is that?
Because Humean ought is that type of ought that is not purely descriptive. That's part of the definition of.
And then the part, okay, so there's it's not purely descriptive. So there's descriptive, and then there's something else, right?
Yeah, if it exists anyway.
What is that something else?
Moral wrongness. It's like you morally shouldn't do something in that Humean ought sense.
Like, I thought the hypothetical ought grounded moral wrongness.
That would require a different moral semantics. You could come up with a system of hypothetical oughts and call it morality, but that would be a different moral semantics, and it would be different from the type of morality that most people use when they talk about moral wrongness. When people talk about moral wrongness, they usually don't have in mind that type of ought that has a purely descriptive meaning. And if you want to, like, you know, have evidence of this, again, think back to Hume's is-ought problem. If everybody used moral semantics where the moral ought had an entirely descriptive meaning, if that was the semantics that everybody used, there would be no is-ought problem, right?
Well, maybe we should back up. I don't see an is-ought problem.
Well, remember, Hume did see an is-ought problem. A lot of philosophers see a is-ought problem. My point is that nobody would have brought up an is-ought problem. This would not be a famous problem in philosophy if everybody used the moral semantics and used a hypothetical ought, right?
Yeah, so there's the hypothetical ought, and then there's this other kind of ought, but I don't understand this other ought at all. So, like what other grounds are there for morality other than the context of the situation, the hypothetical thing that's going on?
So I haven't described in this argument what grounds. So when you talk about what grounds are, you talk about like an ontological explanation for the human ought, like how it exists. Is that what
I
you're asking?
guess I'm just trying to understand, like, it's not purely descriptive. Okay, it's
Right.
not like, soap. We'll just say it's not purely, like, or what should I say? Like, you have salt water. It's not pure water, right? It has salt to it. That's the other thing to it, right? So we can name the other thing. It's not pure water, right? Well, what is it that's not water? Well, it's the salt, right? So what's the other thing in morality that makes it not hypothetical?
Well, as I mentioned before, it prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive.
Well, that's just restating the thing, right? Like, well,
Well,
it's not that
sort
other
of.
thing. Yeah, it's not that other thing. What is the thing?
So this is kind of what I think it was Henry Sedgwick that said something along the lines of like the moral ought is it's so primitive that there really is no way to analyze it. It's a primitive. You could just kind of give examples and hope for the best. And when I was growing up and I was taught about this thing called morality, there's things that you should and shouldn't do. This is just something I naturally picked up that there are things I shouldn't do. And I understood this ought in the kind of normal Humean sense. So maybe there is no way I can describe it any more than I've already have. It's like, how do you describe someone what love is? It's like, I don't know how to describe it in words. It's just something you pick up when you grow up in the culture. And I think the moral ought might be something like this. It's Sidgwick, I think, said something like it's the conception of the moral ought is too elementary to admit of any further analysis. And maybe that's just the way it is.
Huh. Yeah. So does that, I mean, could you see how someone might argue, well, it sounds made up?
Well, there are atheists who believe that moral wrongness, in the normal sense of the term, does not exist. There are loads of atheists who believe that, who deny the second premise in that way. There are moral nihilists. And I think it's
Well, I mean, right, because it's a little bit, I mean, the terminology can get a little strange, right? And I think are it's the words that we're using to describe it that, I mean, even under theism, we're just like, what's the other thing? Like, like there's the context of what's happening, right? It's like what makes a red crayon red, right? Well, the crayon being red makes it red. Well, yeah, but then there's this other thing that grounds the redness. Well, what's that? Well, it's non physical. It's supernatural that grounds the red, that makes it red. Well, then it's already red, right? You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? I don't know. Yeah, I mean,
okay. I was able to find the quote. It was
yeah.
Henry Sedgwick goes as far as to say the fundamental notion behind the moral sense of ought is quote too elementary to admit of any formal definition unquote. So you're not exactly the first person to kind of pick up how elementary it is.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of like saying, well, what, I mean, so something is really, I mean, I would go so far as to say, like, we have sufficient explanation based off of the hypothetical situation to describe why it's moral or not, right? And then,
Well, I mean, if you're using
like,
hypothetical odds, you're basically just changing the subject from what the moral argument is talking about. When, again, with theists talk about the moral argument, they're using that Humean sense of ought, the ordinary sense of ought that people tend to use. They're not redefining it to mean hypothetical odds.
gotcha. Well, I mean, it's like, I think, like, this perspective, like, holds true no matter you're Buddhist or atheist or, Catholic, that it, like, what's the other thing that, like, it doesn't seem to be grounded on religion at all, right? It just seems to be like there's nothing supernatural about morality.
There'd be something at least non-natural about morality if you're using Humean moral semantics.
Yeah, but I mean, it just doesn't seem to be there. Like I don't
That's
know.
a
It's kind
legitimate
of
option
like,
for the atheist to take. They could just say that this type of moral wrongness doesn't exist. They could deny the second premise. A lot of atheists do that.
what? So why are we like saying atheists do that? Like, you would think that everybody would kind of have have issues with this understanding of morality.
I think most people, again, on the ordinary sense of morality, it seems that most people do believe that moral wrongness exists, that it's morally wrong to torture an infant just for fun, for example.
Right. Right.
So I think most people affirm the second premise. I don't know what percentage of atheists affirm the second premise, but it's a substantial number. I mean, if
Well,
you look at,
I mean, I don't know what theism or atheism has to do with it.
well, as I said, given God's not existence, it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists. It seems like you're on that way too. It seems like you believe that moral wrongness does not exist in the Humean sense.
Yeah, I guess how he's describing it, I would just say that, like, it's the situation that, like,
A hypothetical lot, you mean, right?
yeah, it seems to be only the hypothetical lot, right?
If you believe
So
that only hypothetical odds exist, then you don't really believe that moral wrongness exists in the ordinary sense of the term.
see, when I think of moral wrongness, I think of, like, it's well, kicking the puppy hurts the puppy. It causes the puppy pain, so it's wrong.
I mean, that could be a reason why it's wrong, but if the only odds you have are hypothetical, like so again, the hypothetical ought has a purely descriptive meaning. It expresses a possible action is practically necessary to achieve some goal, and that's what it means. That's what the ought means. So it is true
Right.
that so like an ordinary like person on the street moral realist might say, well, yeah, it causes pain to the puppy, but the point is you shouldn't do that. It's causing unnecessary pain is something you should not do in that Humean sense. Because without that type of ought, you wouldn't have
Okay.
morality in the ordinary sense of the term. If all oughts have an
So
entirely descriptive meaning,
okay, so let's focus in on you ought not to do it because so Hume would say beyond causing pain, you still ought not to do it.
um,
No?
he might have. I think he was a moral realist. I'm just remembering that that is not a problem. I call it Humean only because I know that was the semantics he used in that context. He wasn't using a hypothetical ought, clearly, otherwise the problem wouldn't exist.
So kicking a puppy is wrong because it causes the puppy pain.
You could believe that. A moral realist could believe that.
Okay. And Hume would say beyond causing the puppy pain, there's something else that causes it to be wrong.
Yes and no. The only reason I used Hume is because of semantics. Let's just think of like an abstract moral realist. Yes, it causes pain. Now, is there an additional thing that makes it wrong? Well, yeah, it's the fact that we shouldn't cause the puppy pain.
Well, because pain is bad.
You can say that it's like a state of affairs that ought not to be actualized without a morally sufficient reason.
Gotcha. So, I mean, like pain is a physical thing.
That's debatable. I mean, even if I were like a physicalist, I would believe that consciousness and other mental states are an emergent property. That is, it's not identical with physical chemical stuff, but it's just something that gets
Sure.
produced. And even though the
Yeah.
property is non-natural, it has like a substratum that's purely physical. That's what I would believe if I didn't believe in the
Yeah,
supernatural.
yeah. I mean, I can go along with that. And then do you think morality is an emergent trait or an emergent property? Or
I have a different ontological view of morality, but here's what an atheist could believe. They could say that given certain natural state of affairs, moral wrongness just kind of like, emerges on top of that. That's what an atheist could believe. The problem is
well,
then
it doesn't everybody believe that though? I mean, I don't know why we like bring atheism and theism into it. It just seems like this is the world everybody lives in, regardless of what you think, right?
well, again, the reason why I think God has something to do with it is that it seems to me that given God's non-existence, it is unlikely that this moral wrongness would exist.
Yeah, I mean, although why? Because we account for morality and
Well,
like,
because as I mentioned before, it's this moral wrongness, if it exists, is this invisible, non-physical thing that we can't empirically detect. I mean,
well,
think if
just like,
somebody had a belief that every time I drink coffee, an invisible unicorn suddenly appears. Would you believe that? No, you wouldn't. Why? Because it's queer. It's queer in a way to make it prima facie unlikely. And so, from an atheist standpoint, you could say the same applies to moral wrongness. It is queer in a way to make it unlikely, barring any evidence for it.
yeah. I mean, I could say the same thing about the moral argument. It's certainly strange, so I would say that it's unlikely.
No, it's
But
queer means it's wildly different from the types of things we know exist. So it's a specific type of unusualness.
yeah, so yeah, I mean, maybe somebody in the comments can help me understand this, but yeah, it just seems like, yeah, I just don't really understand what's going on. Like, so we're talking about emergent properties, right? Like, consciousness is an emergent property, right? The mind from our brain, right? It kind of emerges,
Someone could
and
believe
then
that anyway.
what's that?
I hold to kind of interactive substance dualism, but that's if the supernatural doesn't exist, I think that's the most likely philosophy of mind, in my opinion.
Okay, so if what doesn't exist?
If the supernatural does not exist, and I had to hold to some philosophy of mind, if I were a naturalist, if I didn't believe in supernatural, the idea that consciousness and other mental properties are emergent properties, that's what I would believe. That would seem most likely to me.
Okay, so let's say like color is an emergent property of like the atoms and molecules that we look at it and we sense color, right? Just the way the molecules are arranged.
Well, our experience of color, our sense experience, I think would be an emergent property if naturalism is true. If naturalism is true, I think the mental experiences would be emergent properties.
So let's say supernaturalism is true. Would still be an emergent property, right?
Well, it depends on what philosophy of mind you hold to. I mean, so if some supernaturalists believe in interactive substance dualism, that there's like a non-physical mind or soul that's interacting with the brain. But that gets as far from the moral argument. The moral argument doesn't really have anything to do with that per se.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, like it's almost like saying, well, like my example of a coffee mug holding coffee, right? The physical mug holds the coffee. But then we're saying, well, there's something else that holds in the coffee. But we already know the mug holds the coffee. So what else is there? Yeah.
Well, again, an
So
option for the atheist is just to reject the existence of moral wrongness as I've defined it. That's certainly an option for the atheist. A lot of atheists do that. You said the only
Well, I
odds that
mean,
exist are hypothetical odds.
so I'm going to be, because I don't have any understanding of what what the moral wrongness you're describing, because we already account for moral wrongness.
Well, you redefining it doesn't really account for it.
Like,
You could
I'm
just
not
say
that's the understanding that I've always had. Like, when you're in kindergarten and why shouldn't you hit somebody? Well, would you like to be hit? Right? Or like, why should you lie? Well, you want to be believed, don't you? Right? What about the boy that cried wolf, and then you're getting attacked by wolves, and then the wolves attack you, nobody helps you. So, what other?
but again,
Like, I'm
this is not a first hint that you may have understood morality to be this way, but that's not the kind of default understanding of morality. If all odds, including morality, were hypothetical, there wouldn't be an is-ought problem in the first place.
yeah.
So you might
Like,
have
I
been
think
unaware of this, but
I'm
that's
thinking. Go
the
ahead.
semantics that people ordinarily have. That's why there is an is-ought problem.
See, I'm not sure that there's another way to describe, like, because to the extent that you're describing something else, you're not describing anything, right? Like, what is it? Well,
Well, you would probably disagree, as well as most people. But yeah, I think you just may not have been aware what people ordinarily mean by morality. That they're not
so
using the hypothetical lot.
like, okay, so let's say there's no physical anything, right? There's no anything. No minds exist, nothing physical exists, right? Then no morality exists, right?
If no minds exist,
Yeah. Nothing exists
um,
at all. Then there's
perhaps
no
it's.
morality.
Perhaps it depends what you mean by no morality. It wouldn't have any practical application. Like there wouldn't be any moral agents or moral patients. So, in that
Yeah.
sense, yes.
So then you add a puppy to the picture, right? It's only a puppy exists, and then you add a foot that kicks the puppy. Then morality exists, right?
Um, if this foot is attached to a moral agent, and this moral agent is doing something morally wrong, then we'd have morality existing in the sense that we have an instance of moral wrongness. The property of moral wrongness would be instantiated. So, in that sense, yes.
And then, yeah, and then so, like, it would seem to me, then we have the supernatural. Supernatural exists.
Well, at least the non-natural, anyway.
See, what's the difference between supernatural and non-natural? I see them as synonymous.
Well, you might. So I'll give an example. So the term naturalism is like a little bit fuzzy. So different philosophers might have slightly different terms. And to kind of avoid problems, I just say it's non-natural. But a naturalist, for example, someone might describe themselves as naturalist, but be a Platonist and think that even though Platonic objects are non-natural, they're not supernatural. Usually when we think of it's like, if you had something outside the natural world causally affecting the natural world, I think that would be enough to call it supernatural. But even there might be a few naturalists who disagree. So there is like a little disagreement on how to define naturalism, what does and doesn't count as supernatural. So just calling it non-natural kind of bypasses that concern. We could say, okay, if it's not a fact of physics, if its property is not part of like physics, chemistry, and so forth, then we could say that this property is not natural pretty safely, I think.
Gotcha. I can kind of see that where it exists in some other sense than physical is what it's saying.
Yeah, it's not part of the natural physical world. It's not a fact of physics, chemistry, and so forth.
Got it. So like thoughts would be non-natural because it's like an emergent property.
Someone could believe that, yeah. A person who's a naturalist might say that, yeah, these thoughts are something that emerge from the chemical reactions, but they're not identical to the chemical reactions. It's just something that happens when the chemical reactions happen. So naturalists could believe that and say it's not natural. It's a not quite a natural property. Yeah. So
Okay.
naturalists could believe that, for example. Maybe that's probably an easier pill to swallow for a naturalist than Platonic objects, I think.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have a puppy. The only thing that exists is a puppy and a human. Human kicks the puppy, causing the puppy pain, right? And then let's say we have like a light switch, and we supernaturalism is true, supernaturalism is false, and we switch it, and then the puppy is kicked. The puppy is kicked under supernaturalism. There doesn't seem to be any difference under the morality of the situation, right?
Well, so that's what I mentioned before about the moral nihilist and moral realist. I mentioned that they both they all agree on the same natural facts, all the physical, psychological facts. They all agree, and that's why I mentioned that clearly moral wrongness would have to be non-natural then, because all the natural facts are the same. The only thing different is moral wrongness, and so moral wrongness is a non-natural property in the ordinary sense of the term. That's why moral nihilism and moral realism are empirically indistinguishable from each other. Moral wrongness is empirically undetectable in that way.
Okay, so if we're talking about like under a Platonic sense that like there's the idea of the thing and then there's the actual thing, those are different things, right? And
That's one way to describe Platonism, I suppose. Yeah.
yeah, and so the morality is like an emergent property of the situation, and so in that way it's not natural, but it's all physical, right? So there's nothing like spooky about it, right?
Well, it's a property of something physical anyway.
Yeah. So so under that sense, we can say that morality is non-physical, but it's really physical, right?
Well, no. Otherwise, the moral nihilist and moral realist wouldn't be disagreeing with each other, right? Because they agree on all the same physical facts.
I mean, it's just a difference of the words that they're using, right? Because, I mean, it like whether we talk about it as like an emergent property of the situation, right? We're really talking about the descriptive odd, right? But we can kind of phrase it in other terms, whether it's like an emergent property, it's like a non-physical thing. But I mean, it's all based on the physical, and it's physical processes that are happening, right?
Well, physical processes are involved, but if you're using the Humean moral semantics, then it's inevitably going to be non-natural.
And by non-natural, we're still saying physical, right? Because it's physical processes.
No, non-natural means not part of the natural physical world.
So where does it stop being part of the physical world?
So, well, I should clarify. It's not purely part of the natural physical world.
What's the thing that's not part of the physical world? Like, so I mean, there's the physical world, and we can all say like, yeah, there's the physical world, but then what else is there?
Well, there's that Humean ought. The Humean ought is not reducible to the purely descriptive. It doesn't have a purely descriptive meaning. It's not a hypothetical ought. It's that other type of ought.
Yeah. So I mean, it ultimately, because then we're kind of going into the same thing that, okay, what's the part of it? So it's not purely descriptive. So what's the part that's not descriptive? Then we just say, well, it's just so basic it can't be described, right?
Well, I mean, I don't. Henry Sidgwick, as I mentioned, he said the concept is too elementary to admit of any formal definition. It's kind of like, yeah. So it's hard to describe to someone who doesn't already know what it is, except for maybe giving examples and hoping for the best.
Yeah, it's almost like, what's an example of that?
I mean, think about love. How do you describe it? It's kind of difficult. Maybe you give examples and hope for the best.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that are hard to describe, right? Like,
how do you describe color to a blind man? How do you describe love to someone who's completely emotionless? I mean, it's pretty hard to do.
Well, I mean, although dictionaries do a good job of it.
Well, sort of. I mean, but eventually you get a part where something is circular, like A means B, B means C, C means D. But imagine handing a dictionary to someone who doesn't know a lick of English and all the words are written in English. Well, they're not going to understand crap. You got to start with something. You got to start with some English words in order to use an English dictionary.
Mm.
And that's kind of we have here. I can describe an ought maybe in different terms, but if you don't understand any of those terms to do, it's like, what does ought mean? Well, it's what you should do. What is should? What you're supposed to do. What does that mean? It's like, eventually you're going to run out of words, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we're kind of saying like morality under like this Humean sense kind of doesn't, it's inexplicable, right? It just has no explanation for it, right? So
Well,
just as like,
that doesn't quite, it's not quite what I said. I just said it's quoted Henry Sidgwick in that the moral sense of ought is too elementary to admit of any formal definition. It's hard to describe in any rigorous way. And anyway, it's just something a lot of people kind of just grow up knowing and getting an intuitive feel for what it is just by having an experience with the language. Apparently not everybody, but most people.
yeah, I almost want to do a poll of people that understand morality in terms of this
A hypothetical ought
human
versus
sense.
human.
Yeah, which to see if that's true, but
My own informal survey of the matter, it seems that most people are using that Humean sense.
yeah, because I mean, I think until now I've not heard of a different way of describing morality. That
I mean, have you ever heard of the is-ought problem?
yeah,
Yeah, but
but
when you think about it, just think if the word ought had an entirely descriptive meaning, this wouldn't be a problem in the first place, right?
what other meaning is there? Like I don't see another meaning than descriptive.
But one thing at a time. If the moral ought, if the ought had an entirely descriptive meaning, the is-ought problem wouldn't have existed in the first place, right? You could deduce an ought from an is if it had an entirely descriptive meaning, right?
Right? Yeah.
Right. So he couldn't have been using a hypothetical ought, right?
Well, okay, maybe I misspoke. So ought only makes sense. You ought to do it. Well, it's like, is $5 a lot of money? Well, it depends on the context. Like for a car or for a gallon of gas or what? Like what makes it a lot of money, right?
So a
Like
hypothetical ought in philosophy is it has a descriptive meaning. It refers to an action that is practically necessary to accomplish some goal. So an example would be when if you want to do well in school, you ought to study just means something like as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. So that's what a hypothetical ought is, or a conditional ought. It's a type of ought that we use all the time under a discourse, but it has a purely descriptive meaning. But if that's all the oughts were, if all oughts were hypothetical, including moral oughts, if that was our moral semantics, then we wouldn't have had an is-ought problem in philosophy. Right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't see the like all thing. Like if you say, well, you should do this, and then what's the person going to ask? Well, why? Why should I do that? Well, you just should for no reason or for reasons that are just too basic to understand.
Well, there are a couple ways to go about it. You could say, like, imagine like a psychopath, for example, who, doesn't care about being a good person. Imagine a psychopath. I mean, a psychopath could care about being a good person, but never mind that. Imagine someone who doesn't care about being a good person. Okay,
Right?
And you say, why ought I do that? Well, you can give someone pragmatic reasons or practical reasons. Well, because you'll get in trouble. You might get put in jail, and that might be a reason why they don't do it. But that's a different type of reason. So it's possible for a morally wrong action to have reasons to be their some moral duty to have some practical reason behind it, in the sense that here's a practical reason to follow moral duty. But it's just that most people, in addition to there being practical reasons to do moral duty, it's just something that you shouldn't do, like full stop. why should he torture? There is the case that torturing an infant just for fun, for example, is just something you should not do, full stop. And that type of in that context would be one that does not have an entirely descriptive meaning.
Well, I mean, it's kind of smuggling in the description, isn't it?
What is?
But like just for fun part, right?
Okay, so remember, what I described as a human odd is the type of odd that does not have only descriptive qualities. That's compatible with there being some descriptive qualities. So in philosophy,
so
there's type of...
This thing, we're kind of saying that there's no morally sufficient reason for it, right? If you're just going to say just for fun, right? So like when we look to the reasons why something is moral or immoral, right? You don't have a duty to do that to an infant. Well, it's certainly not, from hedonism grounds, it's not legit. From utilitarian grounds, it's not. For like, right? So you can see like kind of on every front of why it would be moral. You can just say it kind of fails under all of it, because you're saying just for fun. Why? Well, why should it be fun to do that? You're right. Like it just seems like we have goals in mind, and it fails all of those, right?
Well, yeah, but even a utilitarian will typically believe that, say, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people is something that we ought to do in that human moral ought sense.
Yeah.
So even a utilitarian can easily have that type of ordinary moral semantics in mind.
Yeah. Right. So like we're saying, why ought we not do that? And then there's all the reasons, right? All of the reasons say don't do it. So you don't need anything more, right?
Depends on what moral semantics you're using. If you're using a moral semantics that has the hypothetical ought, then yeah, you don't need anything more. But under ordinary moral semantics, people tend to use the human ought. And if you're using that semantics, it follows that it's going to be non-natural.
Got it. So yeah, I mean, I would just say when people are saying human ought, they just don't understand morality.
You think everybody doesn't understand morality but you?
Well, I don't think I'm the only person that believes in descriptive oughts, but I mean, and it holds true under any viewpoint, I think, like whether supernatural exists or it doesn't, whether like but I mean, like I think most people, I would say, are describing a descriptive ought. And maybe there's a few people that just say, well, it's just so. Well, it's not just so. It has reasons, right? It's not ultimately inexplicable, right? We can describe why it's wrong.
Okay,
right?
Do you really believe that when most people talk about morally wrong, they're using hypothetical oughts?
Yes.
Is that what you believe?
Yeah.
Even Hume.
That's what he's describing. But so it's kind of like you have God. Like people would have different conceptions, but what they're describing is something like, this is how the universe came to be, right?
One thing I had in mind, do you think Hume was using hypothetical ought for morality? Do you think that was his moral semantics?
Ultimately, yeah.
But then if that were true, there would... Okay, do you agree with this statement? If Hume were using a hypothetical ought, that type of ought that has a purely descriptive meaning, then there would be no is ought problem.
Okay, so say that again. So if he's describing something...
If Hume's moral semantics, that moral ought, had an entirely descriptive meaning, then there would not have been an is ought problem.
I'm trying to understand that. So if he's describing something that's purely descriptive, right?
No. If Hume's moral semantics, do you remember what the hypothetical ought is?
Yeah, like there's a goal in mind. There's a reason behind it.
More specifically, it's when it has a purely... It describes a possible action that is practically necessary to achieve some goal, where if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to go
Right.
to school. It has
Right.
a purely descriptive meaning. Now,
Right.
if Hume's moral semantics were the hypothetical ought, then there would not have been an is-ought problem. Is that true?
Let's say, okay, so the way he's describing it, there's something else beyond the situation that makes the situation moral or unmoral, right? And so he's describing it as there's like a mystical, supernatural thing going on.
No, that's not what I'm ascribing to Hume. I'm just saying that if his moral semantics were such that the ought had an entirely descriptive meaning, like a hypothetical ought, if you had an entirely descriptive meaning in mind for the moral ought, for the ought, then there would not be an is-ought problem. Do you agree with that?
I'm inclined to say I don't agree or disagree because
okay,
I don't
here's
know.
why I think the answer is there would not have been an is-ought problem. So Hume noted that there's a difficulty in deducing an ought from an is. It's like, how do you do that? That seems hard to do. The reason why it would not be a problem if the ought we're using were a hypothetical ought is because it's a descriptive meaning. You could say, here's an is statement. Suppose, for example, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. You could deduce from that, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, because they mean the same thing. That statement and that statement are synonymous. So you could deduce an ought from an is if it had a purely descriptive meaning. But because Hume was not using that semantics, that problem would exist. The only way that problem could exist is if he were not using a descriptive meaning in his semantics.
Yeah. And then we get to, well, what does he mean by it?
Well,
and then we can't really describe a morality in a different sense, right?
Well, I think most people, as I say, grow up understanding the moral ought as just like Hume does. Hume was using that other type of morality I mentioned earlier when I did my slide presentation, that type of ought that is not reducible to purely descriptive. It's not the hypothetical ought. It's that other type of ought that most people tend to use when they think of morality. The type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities.
Gotcha. Well, how about this? I'll put on the community tab poll, and I'll work with you on the wording of it, and we'll see if what people mean when they say morality, if it's descriptive or Humean. And I'm going to bet that people are going to say descriptive, but we'll find out, I guess. Does that sound good?
All right.
But all right, so here, yeah. So maybe we'll end it there. Did you have any a wrap up or any final thoughts on it?
Yeah. So we veered away a lot from the original topic of the video.
Sure.
So my thinking was that even if you think the moral argument isn't sound, you shouldn't think that the argument is quote unquote terrible. Because if you're an atheist, you believe that God does not exist and moral wrongness does not exist, you're rationally committed to accepting the first premise. And so for an atheist, there are a lot of atheists that I either agree with one of the premises or are rationally committed to believing one of the premises. And there are substantial numbers behind both premises. So I think if the argument were quote unquote terrible, you would find more unanimity about which premise is false. As it stands, there are a lot of atheists that believe that the second premise is plausibly true. And there's a large number of atheists who are either believe or rationally committed to accepting the first premise. And because each premise enjoys some substantial plausibility among those who deny the conclusion, I think we should rate it higher, even if we think the argument doesn't sound.
Yeah, absolutely. So there we have it. We have proven the existence of God 100% once and for all. So if you want more rock solid 100% absolute arguments, go subscribe. Maverick Christian. That's the YouTube channel. I'm subscribed. At least I'm pretty sure I am. I'd have to look back. But and then the blog, Maverick Christian. Is it maverickchristian.com? Or what's the URL?
maverickchristian.org.
.org. All right, there we go. So yeah, thank you so much. We should do it again. And yeah, thank you everybody for watching.